Continuing what I started with my last video, I'm doing another season preview for today's upload. In my last video, I started the series off with the Sixers, and today I was in the mood to do the Kings. The structure is going to be similar to last videos, and I'm going to put chapters in the video in case y'all want to skip around. But with that being said, before I start talking about what I expect for the Kings this year, I need to talk a little bit about what happened to them last year and the year prior. Going back to the 2022-2023 season, the Kings had finally arrived and became the number 3 seed in the conference, but they lost in 7 games to the Warriors in the first round due to Steph's heroics. Fast forward a year later, and they get the 9 seed, and they lose in the second play-in game to the Pelicans without Zion. And for the most part, they ran it back from the previous season, but ended up getting wildly different results in the regular season. If you compare the Western Conference between those 2 years, it's actually not surprising because the West had that much better of a year last year. In fact, the Kings' 48 wins in 2022 and 2023 got them the 3 seed, but 48 wins in 2024 would have gotten them the 9 seed, and they ended up getting the 9 seed anyway with 46 wins. And really, this is mainly due to the emergence of teams like Dallas, Minnesota, and OKC last year, while the Kings decided to stay in place in the previous offseason. So even if you want to say that the West was too stacked for them last year, why did they lose to a washed Warriors team and a Zionless Pelicans team the year after? Starting with the Warriors, the main reason they lost that series is that their team archetype of a top 5 offense and top 5 defense rarely gets out of the first round, and Sabonis also ended up shrinking in that series. Fox didn't have a very efficient series either, considering that his true shooting was 52.4%, but Sabonis was even worse at 51.7% as a center. Couple that with the fact that he can't protect the rim hardly, and he got beat hard on the rebounds by Looney. It just shows how washed the Warriors had become, considering that they needed 7 games to win that series. Steph also had 50 in Game 7, and that goes back to their team not having a good perimeter defense as well. We saw in the next series how impactful rim protection is when AD shut down the Warriors' offense by being able to sag off Draymond all series. But after how obvious their flaws were after that series, the King decided to run it back despite several teams clearly being on the upswing going into the next season. This resulted in them winning 2 less games and dropping into the lower play-in. Also, instead of having a top offense and a bottom defense, they ended up being middle of the pack in both in terms of offensive and defensive ratings. Their net rating also dropped from a top 10 to a top 20 team, so just based off of that alone, that did not have an overall step forward. They managed to beat the Warriors in the first play-in game, but lost to the Zionless Pelicans in the next. The Pelicans also went 6-0 against the Kings last season, for whatever that's worth to you. But in that game specifically, we saw Fox have another inefficient performance, and their bench only contributed 12 points. I would personally take the Kings into a 7-game series with Zion not being present, but even then there's no way that they're beating the Thunder in the first round anyway. So going into this offseason, it was clear a change needed to be made, and they did that by getting rid of Harrison Barnes in exchange for DeMar DeRozan. Barnes was a fine role player for them, but they needed to take a shot, and they did without having to give up too much from their side of things. So I would definitely call that a win considering how weak this free agent class was, and they still have plenty of assets and money to make more plays going forward. The only other big play they made was signing Monk for a cheap $17 million when there were serious concerns he could get more elsewhere. Other than that, they had a pretty quiet offseason. But now that we're caught up to the present with them now, let's talk about what I think about their individual players and then how their team meshes as a whole. Starting with Domantas Sabonis, we all know that he's a fringe All-NBA player, but there are too many questions about him as the centerpiece of a championship team due to his archetype. Sure, he's an offensive engine, sure he's an efficient scorer, and sure he's a monster on the boards, but can he get you a bucket in a late game situation, and can his offense make up for his lack of rim protection? Now, I do think that his post defense is overlooked, considering that post defense is overlooked in general, but he really provides almost no rim protection as a center. There's little to no potential in him improving in that since he's undersized, has a small wingspan, and has very little bounce to him. It's also not necessarily an effort thing because he has very little energy to spare considering that he has to run the offense for this team to thrive. Couple that with his inability to space the floor to the three-point line, and it makes it really hard to build a championship team around him. We've seen it done with Jokic, but Sabonis is not on the same tier as Jokic offensively, and he doesn't space the floor like Jokic, and Jokic ended up providing okay rim protection for the Nuggets during their championship run. The Nuggets also had a strong perimeter defense, and they were able to scheme Jokic away from the perimeter. Again, if you have a player like Sabonis as your first or second best player, you're going to need multiple other all-stars to help out, along with some role players that cover for his defensive weaknesses. A player like Sabonis is going to give you a ceiling that is lower than the championship, but a floor that's higher than missing the playoffs usually. So with that being said, do the Kings have the right pieces to make up for Sabonis' deficiencies? Moving on to Fox, he's someone that does complement Sabonis pretty well offensively. He spaces the floor very well and is someone that does not need the ball in his hands all the time like Sabonis does. So on paper, they do play off each other well, but two fringe All-NBA players being your best players are not going to work unless you have some of the best supporting cast in the league. If we take a look at the Celtics and say they did not have an MVP level player, for example, they still had the deepest starting five by far and a bench that pulled its own weight as well. But with Fox turning 27 this season, he still has potential to take another step forward and not put so much pressure on the supporting cast and make up the difference. However, I don't think this is going to be a leap to MVP level by any stretch of the imagination. There's nothing left that he can realistically unlock in his game, so at this point, what's left would be efficiency and volume improvements. Even then, I'm not counting on that because his efficiency and volume broke out in 2021, but has since not moved dramatically in either direction, in my opinion. So really, I think his ceiling would be All-NBA third team along with Sabonis, which means they're going to need a strong supporting cast to help with the other MVPs that they're going to be dueling in the playoffs. DeMar DeRozan is their first line of support, but not necessarily a very complimentary one. Sure, he does give them some more shot creation and points, but he doesn't have much to offer when it comes to mitigation of Sabonis' defensive weaknesses. And it's not like he's a fringe All-NBA player anymore to make up for that. He's more like a fringe All-Star, and he's getting older at that. He's also a low-volume, low-efficiency three-point shooter, and that's not what you want with Sabonis at all. He also is playing a redundant role with Malik Monk, an offensive playmaker. So while I did say I do like the addition because it is an upgrade from Barnes despite the fit problem, it's not a play that's going to raise their ceiling to the next playoff round in all likelihood. There's only so much offense to go around and not enough defense being played among this big three, if you want to call it a big three. Sure, Fox can hold his own and is elite in the passing lane, but he's not a number one option on defense considering how much offensive responsibility he has. But moving on to their role players, let's talk about if they're going to be enough to overcome these shortcomings. Just going over all of them at once, you have Malik Monk as an offensive spark, you have Kevin Huerter as a shooter, you have Trey Lyles and Keon Ellis to be all-around players, you have Keegan Murray to be a high-volume all-around player, and you have Alex Len as a backup center. And really looking at all of their options there, they don't have a supporting cast that complements their big three very well. They don't have a rim protector, and while they do have some perimeter defenders and Murray and maybe Lyles, they don't have enough to make up for Sabonis and the other non-factors on their defense. While they do have a lot of options for offensive creation and shooting, other West teams have similar levels and they have a top 10 or top defense to go along with it. So with all that being said, I can't say their ceiling is going to be the finals, especially with them being in the West. I expect the West to be tight again between roughly like the 3 through 8 seeds, and I expect for the Kings to be on the lower half of that pack. And they may even be on the lower half of the play-in again, considering that the West should be just as strong as last year. You have teams like the Clippers, Warriors, and maybe Lakers on the downswing, but you also have teams like the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, and the Rockets potentially on the upswing. While I do feel like their floor when healthy is playing for sure, I also think that their ceiling is below a top 3 seed, and therefore the second round at absolute best. I don't see them beating teams like the Thunder, Mavs, or Wolves in the playoffs, and they would in all likelihood have to play one of them in the second round. And I also think they would have a hard-fought series with several other teams below those teams as well. So because of that, I'm putting their range between losing in the play-in and losing in the second round. Should every team stay healthy, I would personally bet on them exiting in the first round. For them to improve their ceiling, they would need to go down a few different potential avenues to get them over this hump. One would be a rim protector that also spaces the floor to put with Sabonis. Those are pretty rare, but we did see with the Celtics, they did that with Porzingis last year, and it did wonders for them on both sides of the ball. If I were them and a player like that would become available, I would wager whatever the market is asking for them and then some. Even if they're just an average player, it would do wonders for their defense. We saw last year, for example, the Thunder held back on getting Gafford at the deadline, and Gafford became an X factor for the Mavs in their series. Another option for them would be for Fox to take a bigger leap than what I'm putting in the realm of possibility. Another opportunity would be for Keegan Murray to make a big jump this year. I'll be honest and say I'm undecided on what his max potential could be, but I will say that I don't think he's getting close to all-star level this year, which is really what they need. So all in all, they've got some good pieces, but the fit with the stars and the role players are not optimal. Bottom line is that their current defensive potential is not high enough to go the distance. I still think this is a team to watch going forward because if they were to get a guy like Porzingis, for example, their potential would skyrocket. I'm going to leave it at that for the Kings, though, and start thinking about my next video. Let me know what y'all thought about this video and comment some teams you want to see me talk about before the season starts. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Comment something if you have something to say, and thank y'all for watching. I guess I'll see y'all next time.